Hello and welcome. Thank you all very much for coming to the second session of the Cambridge Endangered Languages and Cultures group of the term. It is a great honour and a pleasure for all of us here at Kelk to welcome the preeminent Professor of Sociolinguistics, Peter Trudgill, to Crash, to give us a talk today on languages in contact and isolation, mature phenomena and societies of intimates. Professor Trudgill was one of the first linguists ever to apply Lebovian methodology in Britain and currently affiliated at the University of Agder. The models and frameworks he's developed over the last 4 decades continue to have a massive impact on scholars in the field today.
Professor Trudgill has lectured in 4 continents. His linguistic fieldwork has covered varieties ranging from the dialects of Norwich English and newly formed coines of Milton Keynes to emergent spoken varieties of modern Norwegian. And he has published extensively on dialectology, regional variation, and the interface between society and language. In his more recent work, Professor Trudgill has turned his attention to issues of diachrony, looking in particular at socio-historical questions of language change, language contact, and the history of English. And it's on questions of language contact, which we'll be talking about today in part. So with that said, Professor Trudgill.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. I have nothing to say about the introduction except thank you very much. And we prefer that the city of Norwich is pronounced Norwich and not Norwich, just so that you know. What I always say is no itch in Norwich. It rhymes with porridge. There we are. Thank you very much indeed. Very kind of you. Okay, well, as I say, thank you very much for coming. And thank you very much for remembering my title so impressively. I wasn't quite sure what it was until you said. But this is about linguistic complexity and linguistic simplicity. And it's also, you all have a handout, don't you? You all have a handout? Good. And because you'll need to follow the handout, please. Please come in and help yourselves to a handout. This is, I'm going to be talking about what I call sociolinguistic typology. And by sociolinguistic typology, I mean a kind of linguistic typology which is, I hope, sociolinguistically informed. So basically, what I'm interested in is whether there is any connection at all between sociolinguistic factors on the one hand and language structure on the other. So the question I'm kind of asking is, we know a great deal these days as a result of work in linguistic typology about the structures that are available for the world's languages. But one of the things we're not too good at explaining is why some languages have some features and some structures and others don't. Apart from obvious genetic and areal explanations. So what I've been wondering about is whether there is any kind of sociolinguistic explanation, or at least partial explanation, we can propose for why some languages are like they are and not like other languages. And at letter A on the handout, the factors which I've been working on and looking at are listed there. This is, if I can refer you immodestly to my forthcoming book, which is on the last page of the handout, and agreeably at the bottom of the, if your name begins with T, you're used to this. So it's called Sociolinguistic Typology, and it's coming out with Oxford University Press later this year, much later this year, I suspect. So the factors are the degree to which a language variety experiences language contact, the nature of the social network structure, as per Leslie Milroy's pioneering work on social networks, the degree to which the community in which the language is spoken is stable or unstable, the actual size of the community, and the amount of shared information there is within the community. Now, obviously, these factors are linked, but they are, in principle, independent. Now, if I can start by thinking about the factor of language contact, it was a source of great surprise to many of us as we gradually realized, starting, I suppose, about 15 years ago, that there were two separate groups of linguists who had diametrically opposed views on the linguistic consequences of language contact without knowing that this was the case. So people who'd grown up in sociolinguistics, like me, and people who worked in pidgin linguistics, in creolistics and so on, we took it for granted that language contact meant simplification. You have language contact, and at the most extreme outcome of language contact is a pidgin language. But even if you don't have a pidgin language, you typically get simplification setting in where you have language contact, and you even get simplification setting in where you get dialect contact. But then we noticed, I'm not sure who noticed it first, the typologists or the sociolinguists, but then we noticed that the linguistic typologists had the diametrically opposed view. They were of the view that language contact meant complexification, not simplification at all. And I like to cite the fact that my good friend and the famous linguist Bernard Comrie, as a typologist, wrote a whole paper about what are the consequences for language contact for inflectional morphology, and he did not mention even once the thing which would occur to sociolinguists immediately, that the consequences of contact for inflectional morphology are that it disappears or is greatly reduced. He didn't even mention that. Okay. So we came to realize that something interesting from a sociological academic point of view is going on here. And I don't have time to go into the argument here, but it turns out that actually we were both right. Language contact does lead to simplification, and language contact does lead to complexification. So how can that be? Well, this is where sociolinguistic typology comes in, and I came round to thinking, Laura Wright was kind enough to call this a great insight that I had, but actually it's bleeding obvious if you think about it. What's going on here, number 3 on the handout, is that there are, of course, 2 different types of contact having these 2 different types of consequence. I mean, basically, it matters what the nature of the contact is, where it is, how long it goes on for, and who are the speakers who are involved. So if you have a society which is heavily involved in language contact, so a high contact society, I'm calling it there at number 3, then we can see that these 2 different types of contact will be, first of all, and there's a misprint in the handout, I'm sorry, it should be short-term post-critical threshold contact. Okay? Now, you don't have to necessarily accept the concept of the critical threshold, but what I mean by it basically is that whereas young children, as we all know, are brilliant language learners, adults aren't. In fact, we could even say that the average adult is a lousy language learner, compared at least to small children, and particularly, of course, in untutored situations. So what happens is where you get short-term language contact between groups of adults, any adult learning a language, or learning some of a language, for a limited set of purposes particularly, is going to simplify that language, because we just can't cope very well with complexity at that level. So short-term adult language contact means simplification, hence pidgins and creoles and so on. On the other hand, if you look at the literature published by the typologists, what they're talking about is long-term co-territorial contact, so contact in the same place, involving not adults or not just adults, but also involving children. So, and of course, since children are brilliant language learners, they can cope with any complexity. And what happens, as explained, for example, by Johanna Nichols, the complexity comes from the fact that one language will borrow stuff from another language, and therefore have more stuff. And here comes the complexity. So, for example, if you have a language which doesn't have evidentials, in an area of South America where it's surrounded by other languages which do have evidentials, and that language acquires evidentials, then that language has complexified by gaining a new device. So this complexification then that the typologists are talking about is additive complexification, additive borrowing if you like, where a language borrows something from another language which does not replace something which it already had, but it acquires in addition to the features which it already had, and so it has additional features. So additive borrowing here. So that's in high contact societies, you can get two different types of linguistic outcome depending on the sociolinguistic type of the contact. And that's just a very simple aspect of sociolinguistic typology. Then, what is simplification? If you look down to number 4, again, I don't have time to go into this in great detail, but I'm working on the assumption that the people who do Pidgin and Creole linguistics have got it pretty much right. And they kind of believe, and I believe with them, that simplification is a whole load of things like the regularization of irregularities, because after all, irregularities are a nuisance for grown-ups to learn. An increase in transparency, in morphological and lexical transparency. So lexical transparency would be something like, take the English word dentist and compare it to the German word Zahnarzt. Zahnarzt, tooth doctor, transparent. You only have to know tooth and doctor and you know what Zahnarzt means. But dentist is not transparent. In English you have to learn 3 words: tooth, doctor, and dentist. Okay. And then loss of redundancy. And loss of redundancy, I mean, all languages have redundancy, but what sociolinguistic typology tells you is that some languages have more redundancy than others. And what we have here, for example, is 2 different types of loss of redundancy. One is the reduction in syntagmatic redundancy, where you repeat information in the syntagm. So, for example, grammatical agreement, where you mark several times the same information, you're repeating the information. So in French you have to mark, if the noun is feminine, then the definite article has to be feminine and the adjective has to be feminine and so on. And the other form of redundancy, and therefore redundancy loss, would be the loss of morphological categories, where semantic or grammatical meanings are expressed morphologically. So examples of loss of morphological categories would be, for example, in Old English, say, the loss of the dative case, which is sort of compensated for by using prepositions. That's a loss of a morphological category. So is the loss of grammatical gender from English. And of course, grammatical gender loss is not compensated for by anything, which makes you wonder what it's for in the first place. I did once try and found the Society for the Abolition of Grammatical Gender. But the only people who seemed to be interested were people who spoke English and Afrikaans. Right? Okay, but actually that's quite an interesting question. What is grammatical gender for? A good thing is for being able to mark students wrong in their French essays. But okay. All right. So if that's what simplification is, then in low contact societies we see relatively low amounts of simplification. So if you go back to number 3 on the handout, in low contact societies, because there's no adult language contact, you tend to get the preservation of existing complexity. So this is how some people explain the fact that Faroese and Icelandic are still relatively complex compared to Norwegian and Swedish and Danish, which aren't so complex. Okay, so insofar as Old Norse had lots of complexity, then the insular Scandinavian languages have preserved most of that or much of that complexity. But okay, so they preserve existing complexity, but where does this existing complexity come from in the first place? Now that's the interesting question for me. And in particular, if simplification consists of the items that I've listed there under simplification under number 4, then it follows that complexification is the opposite of those things. Complexification would mean irregularization, making things more irregular, opacity, making things less transparent, more syntagmatic redundancy, like the growth of grammatical agreement and so on. Where do those things come from? And then about morphological categories, okay, we understand what happens if a language borrows an additional morphological category from another language, but what about if it's not borrowed? What about the spontaneous creation of morphological categories? because obviously that must happen, otherwise languages wouldn't have morphological categories in the first place. So how does that happen? And what is the sort of sociolinguistic matrix in which that's most likely to happen? What are the sociolinguistic conditions which favour complexification of this particular type? So, number 5, my hypothesis is that since what happens in high contact societies is either simplification or additive complexification, we can't look for spontaneous complexification in such societies and in such languages. So it must be in low contact societies that it happens. So the hypothesis is that in small, tightly knit communities, we are most likely to find an increase in irregularity, opacity, and syntagmatic redundancy. And not only are morphological categories most readily lost during language contact, they are also more readily developed in isolation. That's a hypothesis. Okay? And if you think about it, the processes which are likely to lead to irregularization, the development of opacity, syntagmatic redundancy, and so on, these processes are likely to be things like grammaticalization, fusion, reanalysis, and sound change. There's a big role for phonology in here. So that leads me to think, well, what are the sociolinguistic conditions where we're going to get grammaticalization and fusion and reanalysis and lots of sound change? Well, here we come on to section B, because it seems to me that if these are the processes which produce complexity, and the complexity is things like the addition of morphological categories, then we can say that complex features are mature phenomena. I apologize for my voice. It doesn't hurt me. I hope it doesn't hurt you. Mature phenomena. Now, this is a concept I owe to Østen Dahl. In his, I think it's one of the best linguistics books ever written, and if you don't know it, it's on the back page of the handout. He says linguistic phenomena are features which imply a lengthy period of historical development. They presuppose a non-trivial prehistory. In other words, they take a long time to develop. To get where they are, it's taken a long period. So he says that syntactic agreement belongs to the later stages of the maturation process. And he reckons that linguistic features pass through a number of successive stages during which they mature. That is, they acquire properties that would otherwise not be possible. So there are some aspects of languages which require a long time to develop, and without them being given that long period of time, those features would not be there. So going back to the features under A there, contact, social networks, etc., my sociolinguistic typological point of view is that in large, high-contact, unstable societies with loose social networks, the lengthy periods necessary for maturation are less likely to be available. It's not going to happen. Also, mature phenomena are vulnerable to being lost in a high-contact situation. So according to Dahl, mature phenomena are highly prone to being filtered out in suboptimal language acquisition. And suboptimal language acquisition, that means us, adults, grown-ups, okay? We're the ones who are less than optimal at acquiring languages. And he says there's a significant overlap between mature phenomena and those linguistic features which are most recalcitrant in second language learning. All right, so adult language learning is what will get rid of any mature phenomena that there already are. So it would seem to be a good idea to argue that complexity is associated with small size, isolation, stability, and so on and so forth. So you're more likely to get it in those sorts of communities. Okay, now if we move to letter C on the handout, an important thing for considering my problem here is the following. One of the fundamental bases of modern historical linguistics has been the so-called Uniformitarian Principle. This was initially developed by geologists, I understand. Maybe some of you know better than I do. But its relevance to linguistics has been recognized for a long time, and it's been powerfully argued for by William Labov, whose name has already been mentioned this evening, and quite rightly so. The principle states that the knowledge of processes that operated in the past can be inferred by observing ongoing processes in the present. So we can suppose that language structures in the past were subject to the same constraints as language structures now are in the present. And the principle, of course, implies conversely that the mechanisms of linguistic change that we see operating around us today are the same as those which operated in the past, even in the remote past. So this uses the methodological principle, much employed by Labov, of using the present to explain the past. We can't try to explain past changes in language by resorting to explanations that wouldn't work for modern linguistic systems. Okay, that all makes sense, doesn't it? But sociolinguistic typology suggests that there's one very important respect in which the present is not like the past. And this has to do with things like the enormously rapid development of transport and communications facilities in the last 150 years. But even more so, I think, it has to do with demography. And through demography, social network structures, which, as Leslie Milroy has shown us, are vital for understanding linguistic change. The point is, of course, that there are very, very, very many more of us human beings on the planet now than there ever have been. I mean, just to take this country as an example, I mean, England, the population of England in the last 500 years has grown from 4 million to 50 million. There are many people in the world who think that's too many English people. I'm not looking at anybody in particular. A couple of Celts on the front. Okay. So increasing populations, increasing mobility, have led to more and more language contact, more and more dialect contact. People are moving around a lot more. Also leading to larger and larger language communities, so that languages and dialects spoken in small, low-contact, isolated communities with tightly knit social networks and large amounts of commonly shared information, to bring in the other factor I mentioned, such communities are becoming less and less common. And I suggest that this has got implications for linguistic complexity, and, if you like, negative implications for linguistic complexity. Labov himself, in his discussion of the Uniformitarian Principle, says that we have to be wary about extrapolating backward in time to Neolithic pre-urban societies. I find his use of the word Neolithic very thought-provoking here. If you think about it, nearly all of the history of human language, as far as we know, took place in pre-Neolithic or Neolithic societies. So if we suppose that human language came into existence about 100,000 years ago, I mean, people vary widely in their estimates of this, but let's say at least 100,000 years ago. And if you think that the earliest state for a post-Neolithic society anywhere in the world is about 5,000 years ago, in the Middle East, and much later in many other places, this means that human languages were spoken in Neolithic and pre-Neolithic societies for something like 95% of their history. Okay? So, letter D on the handout, until the domestication of plants and animals, our ancestors were all hunter-gatherers. And as such, they belonged to societies of intimates, this term I've used in my title. So this term is due, as far as I'm concerned anyway, to Givon, 1979. So he says societies of intimates are societies where all generic information is shared. So all information is common. And as described by Givon and Young, societies like this, societies of intimates, contrast with societies of strangers, which is what we are living in right now. So these are the larger and more complex human groups that began to develop about 10,000 BC and which most of us inhabit today. So for nearly all of human history, we lived in societies characterized by, as Givon says, and I I have to say, of course, I've come up with the features that I'm working with before I read this work. We used to live in societies characterized by stability, small size, he says no more than 150 people, restricted territorial distribution, he suggests a radius of no more than 20 miles, cultural uniformity, and what they also call informational homogeneity. So, as I've been saying, large amounts of shared information. And of course, they were also societies which necessarily had dense social networks. Now, given that the development of large fluid communities is therefore a post-Neolithic phenomenon, and indeed mainly a modern phenomenon, when I say modern, I mean in the last 2,000 years, all right? Then a sociolinguistic typological perspective suggests that the dominant modern standard languages of today are likely to be seriously atypical of how languages have been for nearly all of human history. And of course, this poses an interesting problem for linguistic typology. A great deal of attention is paid by linguistic typologists to sampling the world's languages for typological processes. So if you don't know about this, it's fairly obvious. They try and avoid areal bias. They try and bring in languages from all over the world so that they don't favour one area over another. And they also try and remove genetic bias. They want to have all the language families of the world represented, so you're not skewing the data in that way. But what I'm suggesting here is that there is also a problem of chronological bias. And of course, that's a problem you can't do anything about. It's an insuperable problem. There's no way we can make a genuine sample of all the languages which ever existed. We can do our best with the ancient languages that we know something about. But if modern languages are not, on the whole and on average, typical of how languages have been for all of human existence, then a representative modern sample will not actually be representative. I don't have a solution to this problem, by the way. And this perspective also indicates that we're likely in future to see fewer and fewer mature linguistic phenomena in languages. You know, if you need a stable society with not very much adult language contact for mature phenomena to develop, then that's going to be less likely today. And if what we're seeing now is the long-term decrease in the number of communities which are societies of intimates, this suggests that linguists should consider, in particular, what features are more likely to be associated with such societies. So, I mean, if societies of intimates are going to disappear, or become very, very rare, then we need to think very carefully about what linguistic features are likely to be associated with these societies and disappear along with them. And, of course, societies of intimates are necessarily small communities, so we're talking about so-called small languages, and small languages are the ones which are, more or less by definition, most in danger of being lost to the world, and therefore being lost to linguistic science. And that's what we're all about, I guess, here. So, what sort of phenomenon am I thinking about? Well, I'm thinking about mature phenomena in general, but I'm also thinking about phenomena which seem most obviously to be associated with societies of intimates. So if you look at D on the handout, D1, here's an example. Bob Blust has an account of bizarre changes in an Austronesian language. The example you can see there is from the language Trehet. Proto-Manus, the proto-language, had a pre-nasalized alveolar trill, ndr, which turns out in a daughter language to be k. Now, most people will tell you that's a pretty bloody odd sound change to have taken place. And his discussion of this particular feature and a number like it in the same language, so he comes up with this explanation. Speakers may sometimes engage in a conscious arbitrary manipulation of linguistic symbols. In other words, they did it on purpose, is what he's saying. They deliberately introduced this sound change. The only way he can think of explaining this particular change is to suppose that speakers did it deliberately. Now, if you feel skeptical about this, and of course you do, quite rightly so, then Blust goes on to refer to work by Laycock, who describes a situation in the Uisai dialect of Buin, a Papuan language spoken in Bougainville, where all masculine nouns are known. You know, we know historically what happened. All masculine nouns became feminine, and all feminine nouns became masculine. Now, what Laycock says is, there is no accepted mechanism for linguistic change which can cause a flip-flop of this kind and this magnitude. And I think we have to accept that he's right about that. So he says that at some stage in the past, some influential speaker of the Uisai dialect announced that from now on, his people were not to speak like the rest of the Buin, and once the change was adopted, it would become the natural speech of the community with 1 or 2 generations. Well, what can you say? That's a good, plausible, isn't it? Unlikely, but plausible. So, even if this is, whether or not this is true, if it is true, it's certainly not the kind of development that's likely to seed in anything other than a small, tightly knit society of intimates. Can you imagine sort of trying to get everybody in Cambridge to agree to change the past tense of, I don't know, bake to book or something? You book a cake. No, you can't do it. Okay, so, and there are actually other more important, I think, and less bizarre linguistic features which, from this perspective, are likely to be lost as societies of intimates disappear. Some of these involve morphological categories, which are, you know, a natural part of complexity, if you ask me. But they're morphological categories which are, and they're morphological categories which I associate speculatively with societies of intimates, and they are also categories which Dahl says are cross-linguistically dispensable. In other words, languages can do without them. So they're superfluous. He calls cross-linguistically dispensable categories verbosity. This is an example of verbosity. So here are a few for your consideration, and many of you will know far more about these categories than I do, but for those of you who don't, good. Okay, so at E on the handout, here are some cross-linguistically dispensable categories. The dual number. Now, as a matter of historical fact, nearly all European languages have lost the dual number in the last 2,000 years. Some, like English, lost it a long time ago. Others, like Polish, lost it more recently. Do we know when? Sort of 18th century or something. And some others still retain it. But one striking thing about this development is a loss of verbosity. You don't need the dual number, right? But it's gone hand in hand with this demographic expansion that I was talking about. Is it a coincidence that dual number has disappeared as societies have got bigger and bigger? And of course, massively bigger in many ways. I think you can argue that it's unlikely to be just a coincidence. It's noticeable that those European languages which have retained the dual number are spoken by relatively small numbers of speakers, by European standards. So Slovenian, said to have preserved the dual number, right? 2.5 million speakers of Slovenian? But mostly they're spoken by very small numbers of speakers, like Sami, Lappish, if you like. And on this point about demographic expansion, according to Einar Haugen, the linguist Tilden in 1956 speculated on the gradual disappearance of the dual from Indo-European as evidence of social change from a primitive face-to-face society to one of greater mobility. In 1956 you could talk about primitive societies. We can't and won't do that now. Now, if that's true, well, there's some suggestive work being carried out, which is, I think it's sociolinguistic typological work. There's some work being carried out which is suggestive about, if it's so, why it would be so. And this is work by Perkins. I'm quoting here from Perkins, 1980. Yes, 1995 will do just as well, all right? Perkins, 1995. He takes, as a starting point for his research, a suggestion by Ed Keenan that deictic systems are better developed in non-literate communities with fewer than 4,000 speakers. All right, that's a very precise script. In the non-literate community with fewer than 4,000 speakers, you're likely to have more deictic categories. Morphological categories, notice. Okay. Perkins' argument is that deictics identify reference by connecting them to the spatio-temporal situation. So what he says is the spatio-temporal axis of speech events. Okay. Where you are and when you are, basically, is all it means. And the point about deictics, he says, is that they involve the requirement that the spatio-temporal context of their use be available for the interpretation of the intended reference. Okay? So everybody's got to know what you're talking about. So Perkins conjectures that deictics will be more salient in less complex cultures than in more complex cultures. He then goes on to say that deictics are therefore more likely to appear in the inflectional systems of the languages concerned, as morphological categories, than more peripherally as being marked lexically or periphrastically. And that's in turn because they will be used more often and therefore are more likely to become grammaticalized and end up being inflections or whatever. So he actually investigated 50 languages and their usage of 7 deictic affixes. The affixes were affixes for tense, person marking on verbs, person marking on nouns, that happened, spatial demonstratives on verbs, spatial demonstratives on nouns, inclusive versus exclusive on person markers, and the dual number on person markers. And he ranged communities on a continuum of cultural complexity. So the language of the Andaman Islands was graded as 1, and Vietnamese, for example, was at the top of the list, one of the languages at the top of the list, with 5. Now, and then he was able to show statistically that there is a correlation between social complexity, as he calls it, and the presence of deictic affixes. I won't bore you with the statistics, but it pans out. His thesis is quite definitely demonstrated on the basis of the 50 languages he looked at. Now, as a linguist, I personally feel a bit uncomfortable about the notion of cultural complexity. I don't know if there is such a thing, and I don't know what it is. But I'm very happy to leave this to the anthropologists and to point out that we, or I anyway, probably don't need to look any further for linguistic purposes than just to how big the community is, community size, and how much shared information there is. And of course, there's a link between those two things. And that does it for us, I reckon. So what's probably crucial here is simply how many individuals are involved in a particular speech community and how much shared information is around. In other words, we're talking about a profile of societies of intimates. The more like a society of intimates it is, the more likely you are to get this increased deixis. And if that's so, well then the sad tale then would be that an increase in community size and a loss in intimacy in the modern world, which we are seeing, may well lead to an increasing loss of deictic categories, including dual number, trial number, quadral number, and so on. These things, if I'm right, are likely to, over time, disappear from the world's languages. And will they ever come back again? There's no reason to suppose that they would. E2, this is a related feature. Cross-linguistically dispensable categories, large pronominal systems. Personal pronominal systems also seem to be related to type of society. Eichenwald and Dixon have pointed out that the most complex pronominal systems in the world's languages tend to be found in small-scale language communities with a classificatory kinship system. The crucial thing for me is small here, okay? And there does seem to be a good prima facie case for investigating this. In particular, the presence of the category I was just discussing, dual number, or trial, or even bigger, in such small-scale communities can help in connection with the inclusive-exclusive dimension. You know what I mean. If I say, we're going out to the Ritz Hotel tonight for slap-up dinner, and you say, that's wonderful, and I say, no, not you and me, you and him over there. Okay, so exclusive versus inclusive pronouns. That can bump the number of pronominal categories up to a rather large level. To give just a few examples, the indigenous languages of Australia, small group languages mostly, typically have at least 11 pronouns, number E2 on the handout, involving first, second, and third person, singular, dual, and plural numbers, and exclusive and inclusive we. I give the example of Nyamal there. Fijian has an even larger system, as many of you will know, because of the additional trial number. So they have a particular category for 3 people. And you can see that presented there. That's from Bob Dixon's 1988 grammar. But that's by no means the end of the story. Hutchison has shown that Sursurunga, which is an Austronesian language spoken in Papua New Guinea, it's got about 3,000 speakers, and it has a 5-way number system: singular, dual, trial, quadral, and plural. So plural means 5 or more. And it therefore has 19 persons. That's on the handout there. But if we now add the possibility of gender to the equation, Anna Siewierska claims that the fullest pronoun paradigm that she has ever seen is that of ora. Is that the right click? Anybody know? Anybody? I don't know whether it's ora or what it is. But it has 31 pronouns. As you will have guessed, ora is a Khoikhoi language of southern African nomads, which Ethnologue, if you can believe Ethnologue, it's the best we've got in this case, Ethnologue reckoned it had 50 speakers in 1972, and it now has 0 speakers. And it's got 31 pronouns. It distinguishes between male and female in first and second person as well as third person. It has dual number. It contrasts exclusive and inclusive we. And the system is given there. The C stands for common gender. So you've got masculine, feminine, and common gender. That contrasts dramatically with the totally impoverished 8-pronoun system of French, or the 7-pronoun system of English, and particularly with the pronoun system of Cantonese, which I put on the handout there, which looks like it's got 6 pronouns, but really is only 3 plus a suffix. Now, it's not entirely clear that the link here is actually solely with classificatory kinship systems, as Eichenbelt and Dixon said, and I don't know how that would work, but what is clear is that it's quite likely to be to do with the 5 social factors that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, for their proposed importance in producing sociolinguistic typological consequences. For example, the ora 31 pronoun system really does tally with Perkins' hypothesis about deixis being more prevalent in small communities. So I also suggest that the development afresh of such a pronominal system in any of the languages of the modern world, those that are spoken in societies of strangers, is rather unlikely. Okay, the Khoikhoi 31 pronoun system is gone. Are we likely to see, do we see any signs anywhere of a language in the world developing such a system? No. And even, according to Geraghty, even in Fijian, a number of modern varieties of Fijian are losing the distinction between trial and plural, with, interestingly, the trial form being the one to survive and now being used as plural. My third example of a cross-linguistically dispensable category, an amazingly dispensable category, is generationally marked pronouns. This is another example of a linguistic phenomenon that could only have developed in a society of intimates. And this comes from fairly recent work by Uri Tadmor. Uri Tadmor is the first linguist to have worked on Onya Darat, unless any of you are going to tell me differently. That's an Austronesian language, a Western Malay or Polynesian language, which is spoken in the interior of Borneo, Indonesian Borneo. Now, according to Tadmor, and this really is quite extraordinary, Onya Darat distinguishes between singular, dual, and plural. Okay, nothing odd about that, Austronesian languages. And it also has an exclusive and inclusive distinction. Nothing odd with that. But remarkably, the system also incorporates another very unusual and quite possibly unique, unless you can tell me anything different, a perhaps unique grammatical distinction. Namely, the system incorporates a distinction of generational affiliation. So which generation you belong to. And it's quite complicated. But the singular pronouns indicate the generational affiliation of the referent vis-à-vis the speaker or the interlocutor, with the two-way distinction of forms being between those from members of the same generation or younger generation on the one hand, and those from members of the older generation on the other. In the dual and the plural, on the other hand, the pronouns work differently, in that they indicate the generational relationships with the distinction of forms being between those for members of the same generation and those for a different generation. So this gives you 3 times 3 times 2 plus 2, 20 pronouns. So just to, I mean, if you can't get your head around that, and I admit it took me a while, here's some examples on the handout there. The bottom of that page of the handout. That's 3. That's what letter are we at now? That's E3. Generationally marked pronouns. So in the singular, the third person forms. Okay, so third person singular forms, meaning he or she, are either io or ido. And io means that the person I'm referring to is older than me or the same age as me in terms of generation, not in terms of age. Okay, so the referent, the third person referent, the he or she, is older or the same generation as the speaker. And someone who is younger than the speaker would be referred to as ido. When you go to the dual and the plural, so now we come on to pronouns that would be translated as they in English. For the dual, doduch means two people who are the same generation as each other. So if I say dodu, I'm talking about two people who are the same generation as each other. And if I say damak, I'm talking about two people who are different generations from each other. And with the plural, it's dn versus denak. So to give you an example, this is the one that Uri gave us. If a woman was talking about her granddaughter and her great-granddaughter, she would have to say damak. There's two people, so it's dual, and it translates into English as they, but they are two different generations. Granddaughter and great-granddaughter. If she was talking about her two granddaughters, then she would say doduch, because there are two people and they're the same generation as each other. And I could give you more details, but I think it's getting late. So clearly, a system like this can only work in a society where everybody knows everybody else. You can't do it otherwise. Because generation doesn't necessarily match with age. Your nephew, obviously, might perfectly well be older than you. So a speaker actually has to know the generational affiliation of everybody in the community in order to be able to use the correct pronouns. And this used to work very well, Uri tells us, because each traditional Onya Darat village consisted of a single longhouse with a newly established village consisting of perhaps as much as 6 families, an older village, maybe 60. But you can cope with that, right? Crucially, all the inhabitants of the village lived in the same house and knew each other intimately. That's my italics, my stress. Sadly, extensive destructive logging of the forest habitats in Indonesia have now more or less destroyed this traditional way of life, and the longhouses are disappearing, and very likely this unique pronoun system, this society of intimates pronoun system, is disappearing with them. Finally, evidential systems at number 4. If you're not too sure what evidential systems are, this simply means that there's a grammatical requirement in the language in question that all verbs be marked to indicate what your evidence is for saying something. Wouldn't that be marvellous? Advertisers would hate that. That's why they want everybody to speak English. But just as all finite verbs in English have to be marked for tense, and all finite verbs in Greek have to be marked for person, in languages with evidential systems, they have to be marked according to what your evidence is for saying something. So in the Tariana Amazonian language described by Sascha Eichenwald, who's written the whole book on evidentials, there's a system of 5. So you've got 5 morphemes which are attached to verbs. It's actually more complicated than this, but let's just say there are 5 morphemes attached to verbs depending on what the evidence is. So if there's a visual, she gives the example based on the sentence, José has played football. Okay, so if you use the visual marker, it means you know he played football because you saw him doing it. And the non-visual marker, well, if you attach that, that means you know he played football because you heard it. Okay, or some other non-visual thing. reported, you know he played football because somebody told you. I mean, notice that we can do this in European languages. In English we say, apparently. Apparently there are going to be drinks afterwards, or apparently there aren't going to be drinks afterwards. That means somebody told me that. But of course that's not grammatical, that's not morphological, it's not compulsory. Whereas in Italiana it is. As far as the inferred and assumed ones are concerned, Eichenwald said, the inferred category relates to information obtained through observing direct evidence of an event or a state. So if one sees the football is not in its usual place in the house, and José and his football boots are gone, and his sandals are left behind, with crowds coming back from the football ground, you can infer that he's been playing football. And the assumed marker would be used if José is not at home on the Sunday afternoon, and we know he usually plays football on the Sunday afternoon. You just assume that. Okay. So the interesting sociolinguistic typological question here is, why do some languages have evidentials and some not? That's the sort of question I'd like to be able to answer. Can we say anything about it? Well, Eichenwald thinks we can. I think we can say that evidentials seem to be necessarily mature phenomena. Of course, if they'd been borrowed as a result of additive borrowing, they wouldn't come into that category exactly. But the actual spontaneous development of evidentials seems to take a long time to happen. And so they depend on their genesis for long periods of social stability and low adult-only contact. Not much adult-only contact, because adults would never manage to master that sort of system. And without going into detail, Eichenwald describes how evidentials develop diachronically, and it's mostly a series of long diachronic grammaticalization processes. And Oestendahl also believes, he says that evidential systems are clear examples of maturation processes leading to an increase in system complexity. But Eichenwald also has another interesting, so mature phenomena, yeah, but also has to do with societies of intimates. Sascha Eichenwald says that large complex systems of evidentiality with 4, 5, or 6, even 6 specifications, are found only in small communities. That's what she says. She says it's only in small communities. And she gives a number of languages with evidential systems of that type. There are 3 languages from the Vopesh area of northwestern Amazonia which have a 5-way system, like Tariana that we just saw. It has about 100 speakers. Some other examples. She cites 2 languages which have 6 contrasts. They are both from the southern highlands of Papua New Guinea, Foi, which has about 2,700 speakers, and Faso with 1,200 speakers. And finally, top of the list, she lists 2 Pomoan languages from northern California, which have, as far as she's able to establish, 7 different evidentials. You have 7 different degrees of evidence which you have to go into. And these are Kashaya and Central Pomo, which are listed in Ethnologue with respectively 45 and 4 speakers. And then she goes on to provide an excellent explanatory insight, I think, a la Perkins. Being specific in one's information source appears to correlate with the size of a community. In a small community, everyone keeps an eye on everyone else, and the more precise one is in indicating how information was required, the less the danger of gossip, accusation, and so on. No wonder she says that most languages with highly complex evidential systems are spoken by small communities. But she then goes on an additional step to talk about cultural phenomena. She says, in the context of Amazonian societies, the requirement to be precise in one's information may be related to the common belief that there is an explicit cause for everything, most often sorcery. So as not to be blamed for something that in fact they had no responsibility for, a speaker is always careful to be explicit as possible about what they have done. In any case, the message for us then is that it would seem that highly developed evidential systems may indeed be a linguistic feature particularly strongly associated with societies of intimates and therefore likely to be lost from the world's languages. We know that the Northern California Wintu evidential system was reduced from 5 terms to 2 between the 1930s and 1960s. That's some work that Eichenwald has done. And many other languages with these systems are, of course, dying out or dead already. So, most of the world's major languages today are already Koinese or Creoloids, languages which are the result of considerable language contact, and they have relatively few mature phenomena. So low levels of complexity. John McWhirter has pointed out that Mandarin has much less complexity than other varieties of Chinese. He reckons standard modern Persian is often said to be marvelously simple compared to its relatives. That's what he says. Modern Arabic dialects are much simpler in the technical sense than classical Arabic and so on. And if you look to Creoles, the native speaker languages which have the lowest level of complexity, they're very instructive. They give you lots of evidence, negative evidence, about the sort of linguistic developments that depend on long periods of time and low levels of contact. They're the features which Creole languages don't have. If Creole languages don't have these features, then you can suppose they take a long time to develop. Pidgin languages, of course, typically lack all morphology. They don't have cases, numbers, tenses, aspects, moods, voices, persons, or genders that are morphologically marked. And when you get to creolization, when you get the expansion process that goes with creolization, and some of these categories are restored, repaired. I mean, one of the things that creolization does is to repair some aspects of the simplification of pidginization, but not all. Creole languages typically have optional tense markers and optional aspects markers and optional plural markers, but they still are totally lacking in mature phenomena. It's no surprise that they don't have grammatical gender, because, after all, grammatical gender is an obvious example of verbosity. It's a cross-linguistically dispensable category. And Dahl says, gender, inflectional morphology, and syntactic agreement make up an interesting cluster of phenomena that all belong to the later stages of the maturation process. In particular, Creoles typically lacked evidentials, they lack trial number, they lack very large pronominal system, and they also, to go on, they lack things like switch reference, subjunctives, noun incorporation, polysynthesis, pronoun hierarchies, and all those interesting things. So I suggest that their absence from Creole languages is by no means a coincidence. We might expect that once Creoles have become native languages, which by definition they are, they might eventually develop more complex features. But eventually is likely to be a very long time. And if the social conditions are ever going to be right for that kind of development, if the languages are going to be left alone in low context situations for long enough, is in most cases unlikely. So we can therefore suppose that features like evidentials and trial number and so on are relatively unlikely to be created afresh in societies of strangers, and they're also relatively likely to be lost in high adult context situations. In other words, they might eventually disappear from the world's languages altogether. Thank you.